They can still hear the echo of the helicopters in their dreams. 6 decades down the line, men in their 70s start up screeching, raking their hands across bedsheets they wrongly identify with jungle vines. Their kids question why daddy does not want to go camping. Their grandkids are asking why the fireworks get grandpa in the basement. It is the psychological aftermath of the most psychologically devastating war in American history in modern times. Neither is it a documentary of the wars won or lost. This is what happens when an entire generation realizes that there is no enemy behind the battlefield. It is in your mind. It is in your squad. It is the ground beneath you. Today, we are plunging into deep psychological aspects of the Vietnam War, which are not written in textbooks. The war stories that cause hardened veterans to be silent, still, decades later. That other side of war, where you do not kill just bodies, you kill souls. But before we proceed, the content is about hard historical realities of struggle and warfare and its psychological effects. Viewer discretion is highly recommended. Please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It really helps. Drop a comment with what you want to see next, and share this with a friend who'd love it too. Imagine yourself and 9 other young men, 19 years old, dumped in a strange country where everybody you meet may be a friend or an enemy. In the early morning, the farmer tending his rice field may be sowing bombs rather than rice at night. A kid waving at your convoy today may well be exploding at you tomorrow. This is what used to happen to the American soldiers in Vietnam. Vietnam also came with a newly terrifying aspect of war. A war which had the battle lines that were impossible to see. The invisible enemy. The Viet Cong had mastered the game of masquerading as the civilian people. And this put Vietnam and everyone involved in this war in a psychological nightmare beyond the ordinary war. Veterans explained the hypervigilance they experienced that had overtaken their minds. David Rodriguez, a Marine Corps veteran who is 78 years old, remembers, "You could not trust anybody. The lady with the sweet fruit at the market, she counted our trucks. That youth who assisted at the supplies, was he charting our whereabouts? Each smile might be in the guise of a mask. A helping hand may be a trap setter, but it was not merely an effect of gross mistrust." The Viet Cong had acquired an advanced knowledge of American psychology and lived up to it ruthlessly. The fact that American troops were raised in suburban communities where neighbors looked after other neighbors did not make sense to them, because in every instance, American troops knew that every civilian could potentially be a deadly threat against them. The mental effect was crashing and instantaneous. Military psychologists reported incidents of effective soldiers who never ended up sleeping again because they believed that shutting their eyes was an assurance of death. Others became what we now call serious anxiety disorders, but during that period were just referred to as a case of combat fatigue, or worse, cowardice. A 3-time deployment veteran, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, explains how the mental model changes. "After 2 months, I was a different person. Every Vietnamese face looked the same to me, not because of racism, but because my brain had rewired itself for survival. It was easier to assume everyone was hostile than to make the wrong judgment and die for it." This was a psychological weakness on which the Viet Cong played. This was not only military, but psychological warfare at its most advanced stage. Their methods to remind the American troops they were under observation would always leave behind a trace or two, a displaced branch, an odd footprint here or there. So not to hide, but to prove that they still were under surveillance. Always watched. The psychological nature of this assault was systematic, as seen in the intelligence reports of the time. Villages that showed some friendly disposition during the day would become a hostile area once the sun went down. During the times of rest, local kids played with the soldiers who just disappeared when combat groups fired up on patrol. The point was that it was nowhere to be safe, that nobody could be trusted. Inclusion of children in the networks of human intelligence was one of the most psychologically devastating strategies. It is in military reportings where these experiments are captured, as has been in instances where American soldiers may have formed friendships with local children, but realized later on that they were giving detailed information on patrol pattern, equipment, and soldiers to Viet Cong operatives. That brought about what military psychologists would subsequently refer to as environmental paranoia, a situation of being in fear of the very geography. Trees were no longer trees as they had the possibility of being sniper nests. Rice paddies were not only fields but also places of ambushes. Even the monsoon rains were ominous, as it was a perfect camouflage to the movement of enemies. Psychologically, the price is evident in letters home of the time. One soldier said in a letter to his mother, "I cannot describe it, Ma. It is like being in a nightmare scenario where you cannot wake up. Every single day you are left wondering whether the individual alongside you will still be there the following day. At night you pray and hope that you will see the sunrise. And what is the worst of it? You end up not caring anymore." The psychological warfare tactics of the Viet Cong did not stop at tactics, but continued to psychological torture. They would deliberately wound rather than kill American soldiers, knowing that the screams of injured comrades would demoralize entire units. They would leave booby-trapped bodies of fallen Americans, forcing difficult choices between honor for the dead and safety for the living. Perhaps most terrifyingly, the enemy seemed to know American soldiers better than they knew themselves. Viet Cong propaganda specifically targeted American cultural values: the desire to help civilians, the instinct to trust children, the need to believe in the righteousness of their cause. Each of these values was systematically corrupted and weaponized against the soldiers who held them. The jungle's deadly embrace. The Vietnamese jungle was not only a land, but a weapon. Thick, wet, and totally foreign to the majority of the American soldiers that fought in it, the jungle was a living organism that appeared to be hunting them. However, there was a worse thing behind the natural dangers, and it was the fact that nature had become the source of terror on its own. Environmental warfare had become a black art form developed by the Viet Cong. They used jungle as camouflage, but weaponized it. Each step forward might set active some skillfully hidden trap, which had been so set as to operate most surely upon the passions and to endow with extreme terror. It is perhaps the most psychologically devastating feature of this warfare, and goes by the name of the infamous punji pits. These were no holes on the ground with pointed stakes in them. They were well-designed engines of terror. The bamboo poles were frequently smeared with fecal matter to guarantee infection. However, it was not their killer quality that made these traps smart. It was the effect they had psychologically on their victims. You think of yourself in the thick jungle, already tired, and on the edge of your nerves, when all of a sudden your point man, with a piercing screech, is out of your sight. You run to where you discover him skewered against the brink of a hidden pit, with bamboo spikes forced through his legs, calling his mother as blood gathers amid venomous stick-like wood. As one combat engineer, Thomas Mitchell, explains the psychological toll would be. Says Mitchell, "After they had seen what these holes could do to a man, you never walked the same. Even simple walking was put into question. You would choke and not be able to move in the fear that this was the step, this was the last step. There were guys who could not make a step. The Viet Cong had read on American psychology and ensured that each one of the traps consisted of as much psychological destruction as possible. They understood that fear was more effective than death. A terrified soldier could demoralize an entire unit, while a dead soldier was quickly forgotten. Tripwire bombs that were placed in apparently harmless places would unleash themselves without any warning, thus maiming the victims and not necessarily killing them. The trauma lasted decades because of the sounds of another soldier who called himself out in search of help, realizing that he had been left as bait to an ambush. Specifically known were the bouncing Betty mines. The gadgets would be fired into the air before detonating at waist level, aimed at having maximum effect on the human body. Psychological impact on units was devastating. It was made clear to them that one small misstep can lead to injurious costs that might lead to a catastrophic injury, and this created a sustained sense of terror in units. The stifling humidity sucked the last bit of physical energy, as the ever-present danger of ambush sucked the mental resources. The process of navigation turned into a nightmare. The navigation positions that were based on natural markings on the land became confused in the dense vegetation, and the compass readings turned to be unreliable due to the dense vegetation cover. The soldiers would march to exhaustion thinking that they were moving forward just to find out that they were going round in circles. The noises of the wildlife were used to conceal the enemy's attacks and to produce a state of auditory paranoia. In every bird call there might be a sign. A sniper could be hiding behind any rustling branches. The voices of the jungle became foreshadowing to the possibility of any death. Most frighteningly, perhaps, the swamp caved up a record of its bloodshed. The dead men of other patrols would be lying in their clothes, now used equipment. Torn and tattered personal belongings abandoned as a grim reminder. It was not haphazard. They were crafted to be theatrical in order to have maximum psychological effect. This is the account of Medical Corpsman James Rodriguez, who witnessed such a thing. We came upon what appeared to be a campsite, and yet something was wrong. The weapons were in too orderly fashion. The next thing we found was the helmet, with bullet holes in it, like a trophy on a log. They made us aware of what had occurred to the guys in front of us. The jungle became a place where sanity itself seemed under attack. Soldiers reported auditory hallucinations, hearing voices calling their names from the vegetation. Visual hallucinations became common, with exhausted soldiers seeing enemy forces that weren't there, or missing real threats entirely. The enemy's intimate knowledge of the terrain gave them psychological advantages that went far beyond tactical superiority. They could predict American behavior with uncanny accuracy, positioning traps exactly where stress and fatigue would make American forces most vulnerable. This created a feeling that they were not just fighting human enemies, but battling against the jungle itself as a malevolent, intelligent force. The chemistry of fear. When the jungle was dreadful as it was, with the presence of chemical defoliants, it turned to become hell on Earth. Agent Orange and its chemical siblings did not merely defoliate the trees, but rather contaminated the air that soldiers breathed and made an atmospheric environment of poisonous doubt that would cost lives decades in the future. The irony was ironic and instant. The chemicals were aimed at improving the security of the American soldiers by getting rid of jungle covers which concealed the enemy troops. Rather, these were forms of new, indiscernible, odorless, and unprotectable terrorism. It was at least sniper fire, and you knew where the bullets came. Chemical contamination came at places and non-places at the same time. Soldiers narrate how they walked in regions that had just been sprayed with defoliants, and the surreal feeling that this involves. Trees which less than a day ago had served as a heavy jungle canopy here lay as mere skeletons, with leaves piled together in an unnatural brown carpet of death. It was deathly quiet. Nothing to be heard but dead vegetation crushed under boots. And the shock of the first impression was the merest nothing to that which slowly dawned on them all, that they were being poisoned. The rashes on the skin started initially as angry red welts that refused to heal. Then there were breathing difficulties and constant coughs that choked up blood and mucus with a strangely metallic flavor. Forward observer First Lieutenant Mark Stevens, who once served months in the sprayed regions, recounts the process of horror dawning. We thought this was fantastic at first. No longer the dense leafage to conceal Charlie. Then guys began to get sick. Really sick. Sheets of skin coming off. Hours of coughing. Nobody would tell us either what was being done to us. Janet Harrison, a military nurse, remembers that they would be brought in with terrible skin capers and spitting out muck that looked like bits of their lung. And the worst of it was the fear of their eyes. The whole thing was not right. Somebody ought to know. And they did not. They were disappointed on their own side. The chemical program had established a special depth of psychological terror, since it stood to be a refutation of tenets of service in the military. The troops anticipate fighting the adversary and the foe strategies. They do not wish their command structure to put them under the face of invisible threats that could be more harmful or disastrous than even the enemy can come up with. In letters home, the troops speak of increasing panic. One of the soldiers wrote in a letter home, "Mom, I don't know what they are doing to this place, but it is not natural. The plants are dead in one night, animals are gone, and we are running through all this every day. It seems safe to the medics, but guys are getting sick. Well, sick, as he really was." This betrayal of the soldier went further than the immediate health consequences, to the fact that the soldiers were the unwitting victims of an experiment. Classified military paperwork dating decades shows that the long-term effects of Agent Orange in terms of the health of users remained, to the commanders who ordered it to be used, mostly unknown. The psychological effect, as described by Staff Sergeant Donald Murphy, is explained by saying, "We started referring to it as the dead zone. All was brown and curved, as though the world had died, and we walked about in the body of it. But it was the worst to know that whatever had killed all those plants was in our lungs, on our skin, in our food and water. The Vietnamese civilians were exposed to even greater levels, and because of that, there were moral wounds among the American soldiers who saw whole villages struggling with strange diseases and congenital disorders. A great number of the soldiers said that they felt guilty of being involved in something that they did not know, but that they acknowledged was totally wrong. The realization that the war was being fought with weapons that might be as dangerous to American forces as to the enemy created a crisis of confidence that rippled through entire units. Soldiers began to question not just the wisdom of their mission, but the basic competence and trustworthiness of their own leadership. The knowledge that chemical contamination could have delayed effects, that symptoms might appear years later, created a unique form of anxiety that persisted long after soldiers returned home. Unlike traditional combat wounds, chemical exposure created uncertainty that could last a lifetime. Soldiers lived knowing they might be walking time bombs, carrying invisible damage that could manifest at any time. When humanity breaks. The overall impact of months or years living in such conditions was not only to transform the soldiers, but to break them in the most unexpected ways military training failed to foresee. A combination of unseen enemies, weaponized environments, and exposure to toxins resulted in creating psychological stress on human minds that went past the limits. My Lai may be the most well-documented instance of such an emotional breakdown, but as veterans prove, it is not the only one. Continuous tension, the lack of distinction between a civilian and a combatant, and the increased understanding that rules of warfare were not followed any longer, created an environment in which the moral lines were to be blurred. The reports of psychiatric evaluation during the time, and most of them classified decades later, indicate the systematic collapse of psychological defenses with fighting units. The soldiers who had gone to Vietnam as normal American teenagers had started displaying tendencies that indicated that they were totally changed psychologically. This was undermining the ability to show empathy, which was a key provision in maintaining ethical boundaries in warfare. According to Dr. Sarah Chen, a military psychiatrist who worked with the Vietnam veterans, the combat stress that was witnessed was not the traditional one. It was a new thing, a reorganization of personality on a purely survival basis in a world to which the older categories of morals had no meaning. These brothers were not only traumatized, they were transformed on a psychological level. The degeneration occurred variously in different people, though in definite patterns. Other soldiers were made hyper-aggressive and considered any Vietnamese civilians as potential dangers that have to be eliminated. Their capacity to exercise discretion had been eroded by continued pressure of deciding who was a friend and who was foe. Others simply gave up, and they turned virtually catatonic in the battlefield. These are soldiers who had crossed some psychological threshold in terms of which their minds simply could not accept any more trauma to be exposed in them. They would still be in the mechanical duty of the military, but they would lack emotions in regards to what they experienced themselves. Still others developed psychological numbness, going through the motions of soldiering while emotionally disconnecting from their actions entirely. This dissociation allowed them to function in combat situations while protecting their core identity from the horror they were participating in. Describing the change, Staff Sergeant William Hayes, who had been medically evacuated during the second tour after 2 years because of psychiatric reasons, states, "I believe that sometime in month 8 I ceased being me. I had not yet been shot at all, had not yet come out of the loop, still followed orders, still shot when I had to shoot. I was not there inside. I was enjoying somebody doing these things. And it wasn't me anymore, it was some other person. And he looked like me." The unit cohesion, always considered the main force of the military performance, started to fail, with isolated mental breakdowns affecting the whole platoons. There was loss of confidence between soldiers because everyone became a potential untrustworthy individual given the stress buildup. The traditional discipline grounds started to weaken as non-officers lost confidence in leaders that appeared equally psychologically wounded as other people. The response of the military to this crisis was in most cases counterproductive. Men who exhibited signs of psychological distress were subjected to discipline instead of treatment. And this only increased their levels of stress and strengthened the feeling that they were in an impossible situation that could not be salvaged. Veterans report a sort of psychological contagion that went surging through units undergoing these collapses. The inability to control themselves by one soldier
would result in similar downfalls in others that would affect the performance of a unit within a period of a few days. The inner experience of such a psychological disintegration can be traced in personal letters and diaries of that time. There were reports of soldiers who felt like they were losing their mind, doing things they cannot remember doing, a general feeling of turning into something monstrous and that they do not recognize. There is one diary entry that I found considerably frightening and reads as follows. I did something today I cannot write about. It is something that I must not forget, because in case I forget, then perhaps it never happened. And in case it never happened, I am going crazy. But if it did happen, then I am already crazy. There's no way out of this circle. The deterioration covered not only personal psychology, but also the whole military organization. The classic military discipline is based on a common sense of values and respect among the ranks, as the impossible condition systematically destroys those values. The angle where the whole structure begins to fall is reached. Activity such as fragging, enlisted men attacking officers of their own companies, was becoming widespread as psychological breakdowns spread throughout a unit. These were not cowardice or disobedience in the old style, but the signs of a psychological breakdown in the whole system. But the helicopters are silent no more. Nevertheless, they still have their echoes. It is in the therapy sessions that occur throughout America, in the statistics on suicide that continues to plague the Vietnam veterans who come home in numbers but do not quite get home, and in the families who have yet to figure out why that their father or grandfather or uncle did not quite make it back, despite its body having made it back. The horrifying fact about Vietnam is not on the scale of casualties or tactical interpretations. It can be found in the understanding that the field of warfare was now changed to something that nothing in the human mind could be used to deal within. These toxic exposures, weaponized environments, the invisible enemies, and the systematic destruction of the moral boundaries formed a perfect storm that did not only kill soldiers, but changed them into something they were not prior to their incident. The reason these stories are important is not necessarily that they idealize war or horrify the audience, but rather that they remind the audience that the costs of war go much further than the battlefield, and much further than the soldiers themselves. The crucial significance of knowing these psychological realities is preventing such tragedies in the conflicts that will take place in the future, and taking care of the already dreadful price.